Anyway, our next speaker is Andy Cowan. He's a retired wealth management executive. He was born and brought up in Scotland, as was his wife Margaret, who he's been married to for 43 years. Andy lost his son Daniel, aged 29, to a drug overdose in 2016. He also has two other sons, aged 33 and 38. Since the death of his son Daniel, both Andy and his wife Margaret have been working with Anyone's Child. It's a campaign with Transform Drugs, which serves as an international network for families who have lost their lives and had their lives turned upside down by current drug laws all around. So I'll hand over to Andy.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me? I'm
Yeah.
not too used to using the technology since I retired, so I hope you can hear me. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to speak, and thank you to Peter and to Emma for incredible work that they're doing, which I really, really appreciate given what's happened to us. And yeah, Anyone's Child has been really valuable for me because I have to confess that before I lost my son, the whole drug scene was completely unknown to me. The rationale behind the campaign to change the drug laws was completely unknown to me, or even the reasons why we would do that. Because really, I think, as with most people or many people in the general population, they tend to see this one way. And there's only one way that they can see it, and it's almost impossible for them to see it in a different way. It's a bit like one of these optical illusions that you get, that if you're looking at it, it's a penguin, and somebody then says to you, yeah, but if you keep looking at it, it might become an elephant. And you're trying to see this elephant when you're looking at it, but you just can't see it. And I guess I was in that position where it was all just a penguin to me, that really what should be done is that people shouldn't be taking illegal drugs, and the next government that comes in should be doing more to make sure people can't take illegal drugs, and they should be imprisoned if they do, on and on and on. And I think that's a general view in the population by and large. And ironically, it's what I'm now up against as a campaigner for actually seeing the elephant instead of the penguin. My son was not an addict. He was brought up and well educated and in a good home. He was a lovely, lovely guy. He was in the same industry as I was in, not because I helped him, but because he wanted to follow in my footsteps. He was working in wealth management, and he was doing well. He just got a new job. He did boxing in his spare time. He was a fit guy, a very, very sociable guy, very, very positive, very optimistic. You would have loved him if you'd met him. And now we only found out, later, that he was an occasional user of recreational drugs, just to have a laugh and to have a good time and whatever. And this particular evening in summer of 2016, he was with a friend. The friend had seemingly got some drugs on the dark web. These things are freely available to anybody who wants to buy them. In fact, there's an onslaught of supply of these drugs in the UK. And they took the drugs. Daniel would have been expecting to start his new job, I think, the next day. And as it happened, he didn't wake up. And we got a phone call from the police. We live in England now, but we got a phone call from the police to tell us that he had died. You can imagine just the complete and utter confusion and just not believing the information that we were hearing. And we had to go and see him in the morgue to identify him in Edinburgh 3 days after that. It was totally devastating for the entire family. And really not because of I was listening to any campaigning or listening to any people who want to change drug laws. Really, I started to see the elephant just because I started to think about this, and I started to imagine a world where Daniel maybe hadn't got the drugs from the dark web, where he had no idea what was in them, as Peter said earlier. where they were being supplied by criminals who didn't care about the safety of people that were taking them, who frankly didn't care what was in them. Apparently, the market has been estimated in the UK at something like £10 billion a year. And this is all going into the pockets of drug cartels and criminals. That's who's making money out of this. Somebody said to me, well, if they legalized drugs or they made them available in a legal way, then pharmaceutical companies would make a lot of money. Really? That's what you're worried about? Is it not better for pharmaceutical companies to make a lot of money than for drug cartels and criminals who behead people? So Daniel took these drugs not knowing what was in them, but having no other alternative if he wanted to take some recreational drugs. And I imagined a world where Daniel, rather than going onto the dark web, went down to a local pharmacy and ordered them and bought them and was subject to the normal checks and regulations. And maybe the pharmacist would tell them, this is how these ones best work. Don't take them with this, take them with that. And if we've done a lot of research, we've worked hard on these drugs. We make sure that they give you the best high for the least possible risk. I mean, who's doing that research just now? Nobody, because these drugs are illegal. It's just all darkness and behind the scenes. Nobody's doing that research. But imagine a world where Daniel had bought these drugs at a chemist, had been subject to all that regulation and instruction, and had gone and had his high. I can tell you he would have woken up the next morning and gone to his new job, and he would still be here. And so I started to think about this, and I started to think about the way that we're dealing with drugs in our country. We criminalize people, we put them in prison. About a third of the current prison population are drug users or people in possession of drugs. A third of people are in jail because of the stigma, because we just won't accept it as a society. And people then say to me, well, but actually, if you made it legal, then wouldn't you just increase the supply? Wouldn't more people be on drugs? And there have been countries where they have been decriminalized, and that hasn't happened. Portugal is an example. 18 years ago, they did that. They haven't seen a huge increase in the usage, but they've certainly seen a massive reduction in the deaths. All it took was for them to accept that people take recreational drugs. They have done for the whole 50 years of the war on drugs. And they've continued to do it despite the criminality, despite the threat of imprisonment. Something like 1 in 30 Americans take recreational drugs. It's apparently something like 3 million people in England and Wales take recreational drugs. And that's probably a wild underestimate. And where are they buying all these drugs? They're buying them in a completely unhealthy and completely unsafe way from criminals. And when I started to see the elephant, I started to see that, well, wait a minute, don't we have as a society, an obligation to look after these people? And if so many people over such a long period will use these drugs, then shouldn't we be doing something about it? Wouldn't it be better for us to do the research, for us to take over the manufacture and the distribution of these drugs, where safety is the #1 priority? But all it would take would be for us to accept that people take drugs, and they do, and they will continue to do, and more people do all of the time. The numbers are just absolutely overwhelming, and yet the deaths are overwhelming. I think Peter mentioned 1,300 in Scotland. In England and Wales, it's something like 40 a week. 40 people a week are dying because they're buying these drugs. Now, some other people say to me, well, they just shouldn't take drugs. Really? Is that the best you're going to come up with? They just shouldn't do it? Really? Well, they are doing it, and they're continuing to do it. I was fortunate to have a meeting with Theresa May when she was still Prime Minister, and I put a number of these points to her. I only had 10 minutes, but I put a number of these points to her quite passionately. And, to be honest, I think she would agree with me, she didn't have an answer, except that it wasn't politically acceptable to do anything other than the war on drugs. What a weak position to be in. But if that's true, then the work that Emma and Peter and other organizations like that are doing is absolutely vital, because we need a communications campaign. We need people to hear the truth, and we need them to see the elephant instead of just the penguin, so that we can have a brand new paradigm on how this whole thing works. And finally, let me just say that another objection people give me is they say, well, if people are taking drugs, it must be because they're depressed or unhappy or poor or in difficult circumstances. We should deal with the underlying issues. You've heard American politicians saying this on the right. We should deal with the underlying issues rather than legalizing drugs. Really? You're going to deal with poverty and depression and unhappiness and purposelessness, and you're going to deal with that and come up with all the magical solutions for that before you stop thousands of people from dying because they're buying drugs from criminals that are completely unsafe. That's not the answer. We need an answer that is much, much more short term than that. It's true that we need to deal with these underlying issues. Absolutely. Why do people take all the alcohol? Why do people take other legal drugs? Of course, we need answers for these things. But just to say we're going to ban recreational drugs and illegal drugs, that's the answer. It's not been the answer for 50 years. It's not going to be the answer going forward. It's costing us an absolute fortune in lives and money. And there's another way to look at this. We can see the elephant, not the penguin. And so in anyone's child, I'm just a dad who lost his son and who started to see this in a different way. And I'm working with people like Emma and Peter to try to get the world to see this in a different way. And I think my 10 minutes is up, so I'll leave it at that. Thank you for listening.